She is on the Proof Alliance Board of Directors, the largest organization in the country focused on preventing prenatal alcohol exposure and supporting those impacted by it. And she's here today to tell us about the impact of fetal exposure to alcohol and drugs in general on our communities. So welcome, Maya.
Thank you. So I have to say it is really scary because Peggy says, this is what I pulled off the internet about you. And I thought, oh my God, there's that much detail on the internet about me. And I would walk around, but I think because we're screen sharing and because of the volume, I hope you won't mind if I just stand here at the podium. I feel like, where's my screen back? Sure. Got it. I feel like following on the happy bucks, this is just not very happy subject matter. So I apologize. Peggy and I met at a Proof Alliance event and started chatting. And at the end of the evening, she said, wow, I really think our Rotary Club would be interested in hearing this. So some of this may be old, some of it may be new, but I am passionate about both of these subjects. I have been in the Hennepin County Attorney's Office for 30 years. I have chosen to be in the division that I am the entire time. I did my graduate work to try to better understand the research around child development and then inform our legal system and work on the laws. And I think the way Peggy and I started talking is that really my career in child protection has followed the drugs. So when I started, alcohol and cocaine, and alcohol is at the top because usually if somebody is abusing chemicals, alcohol is in the mix. Right? Rarely do you find someone who says, I only use cocaine, I don't drink, right? So there's kind of the multiple drug use. But when I started, cocaine was really the popular drug. That being said, heroin has always been around. All of these other drugs have been around. But in terms of what we were seeing on a day-to-day basis, cocaine was way up there. And then all of a sudden, crack appeared. And we didn't know what hit us. And crack was a very violent high. So we had a lot of shaken babies, a lot of broken babies. We didn't really know how to treat it. It was incredibly addictive. So much so that people would say after 1 or 2 uses, they were hooked. And of course, every time a drug comes on the market, there's the whole response of, okay, we want to offer services, we want to offer treatment, and we have to come up with all new treatment models. After crack, the methamphetamine really soared. And that, again, was a very different kind of impact on children. That tended to be long weeks at a time of binging, of not feeding the children, of neglecting them, leaving them in the care of people that they shouldn't have been left with. And then what we were also seeing is that because so much meth was being produced in homes and cooked in homes, the residue would settle and it would be on the floors where kids were crawling, it would be on the coffee tables, and we were ending up with a lot of methamphetamine positive toddlers and kids. So not only addictions for the adults, but for the children in the home too. And then heroin appeared. Now, as I said, heroin has been around for a long time, right? But heroin in the form of opioids, prescription opioids, I know this you probably are very familiar with. The whole hydrocodone addiction that started with prescriptions. And this was interesting because it wasn't our normal population. And by normal population, I mean, we see everybody, every socioeconomic level, every race, right? But usually our very, very chemically addicted parents started with alcohol, with cocaine, and built and built and built up to heroin. What we were seeing with the hydrocodone and opioid addictions is that somebody who had had terrible back pain, back surgery, knee surgeries, was prescribed the hydrocodone, became addicted as a patient, often later in life, which again is not something we were seeing, and then couldn't get off it, and then started getting to a point where they weren't going to prescribe it anymore. Then they were buying the pills on the street for $20 a pop, and soon that was too expensive, and it was actually less expensive to just buy the heroin. So a very different entry into the system. And then in around 2016, we started seeing fentanyl hit. And I'm going to be focusing on the alcohol and the fentanyl and fentanyl analogs because I just don't think people understand what is happening in both of those. Disclaimers, I'm not a physician, I'm not a toxicologist, I'm not a neuropsychologist. I do have a lot of experience in this area. I do training around the country for the prenatal alcohol exposure. And more recently, I've been doing a lot of training within the county attorney's office and communities on fentanyl, because I think the communities that are the high-risk communities need this education. But honestly, if you have young people in your lives who might benefit from this information, the best way to get this information out there is to talk about it. And I think that we just don't talk about it nearly enough because we don't think it's going to affect us. I'm hoping by the end of this presentation, you'll see that it very well could affect somebody that you love. So just to start us off, according to the Institute of Medicine, which of the following substances causes the most serious brain injury to a developing fetus? And Peggy, you can't answer. Alcohol. And I'll tell you, the way that I got involved in Proof Alliance was that my building, the Juvenile Justice Courthouse, is attached by Skyway to the Hennepin County Medical Center. And on any given day, I have 6 to 12 little newborns going through withdrawals. And I go over and I check on them. I'm not supposed to, but that's my boundary issue. And one day I was coming out and the nurse, and this little preemie was just going through all the shakes and the withdrawals. It was breaking my heart. And the nurse said, "Oh, he'll be fine. It's the alcohol ones we worry about." What? It just seemed so counterintuitive to me. It seemed so counterintuitive that these kids that were coming, that were born severely addicted to meth and crack and heroin were going to be fine if they could make it through that withdrawal period. But it was the kids who had been exposed prenatally to alcohol who looked fine when they were born, adorable, healthy. Alcohol goes through the system really quickly, so it wasn't showing up on tox screens when they were born. Those were the kids who, when they were 7, 8, and 9, were going to start showing really significant delays, and we'll talk about what they were. And the reason is that alcohol is what's called a teratogen. It crosses the placenta. Not all drugs cross the placenta. So a fetus's blood alcohol level will be the same as the mother's within 20 minutes of the mother ingesting. But obviously, given the size and given the development that's going on, it has been found to have incredible effects on the central brain formation in particular. Now, I do this training and it usually lasts 3 hours just on alcohol. So I'm skipping around and I'm hoping that I'm filling in enough gaps for you to just give you the general picture. But what we're finding is it's because the brain develops throughout all 9 months and even beyond after the child is born, that alcohol really shouldn't be consumed at any point during the pregnancy. Different parts of the brain, and I have a great slide in my other presentation that shows mice develop embryologically very similar to humans. And so while we can't study alcohol effects on humans, obviously we can on mice, and it shows the dark blue parts of the brain that are just absorbing the alcohol and how it's affecting it. So what demographic of women do you think are most likely to drink alcohol during pregnancy? Will be your guess. College-educated middle-class women. That is our target population. And you say, why? Because believe it or not, women who are struggling with chemical dependency or who are in communities where chemical use might be, we tend to think maybe they don't have the same education, but they are actually very, very well informed. Some of the women who are chemically dependent may not have the ability to abstain. They understand. We have the stigma for the college-educated who kind of know, but they don't want to admit. And there are the showers with the mimosas, and then there's the cocktail wine parties. And what we're finding is that when they are asked by physicians, when they are actually, when someone's trying to educate them, there will be this, no, I would never do that. So they also define drinking very differently, which I found fascinating. I have 2 30-year-olds, one of them married to Eric, and I have nieces who are 26 to 30. And when I was talking to them about this, they said, we never thought of what we did as drinking. Drinking, well, that's the binge drinking. That's when you're pounding shots. We don't consider wine drinking. We don't consider champagne and mimosas drinking. The truth is that any kind of alcohol is going to have the same kind of impact. And so we've been doing a lot of educating, targeting specifically, and marketing campaigns specifically targeting women. But for today's presentation, I'm just going to have to ask you to accept that this is settled science. Many of you may be sitting here thinking, well, my wife drank when she was pregnant, or my mom drank when she was pregnant, and I turned out fine, right? Or and when my mother-in-law said that to my husband, he said, you don't know how good I could have been, right? But I need you to just accept that there are variations in how women metabolize alcohol. Nutrition makes a difference. Even twin pregnancies, you can have one that has significant FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum, while the other one doesn't because of the way the fetus metabolizes. And then we know that there are very, very specific days when certain parts of the brain are forming, where if the woman drinks on day 17, on day 27, and we have specific days that are being studied, that there are critical periods that can have much worse effects. So I kind of say it's like Russian roulette. You just don't know which chamber the bullet is in. If you don't play Russian roulette, you're not going to die of a gunshot wound to the head. And that's the same thing with FASD. If you don't drink, your child will not have fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. But right now, every one of these organizations, beginning with the first diagnosis in 73, the Obstetrics and Gynecology, CDC, Surgeon General, American Academy of Pediatrics, every single one has issued a statement that no amount of any kind of alcohol can safely be consumed during any part of pregnancy. How many people know this? If you go on the internet and you search, can I drink while I'm pregnant, which by the way is searched 4 million times a year, right? Which tells me we haven't done a good job educating about this. There are a lot of mommy blogs that are out there where it's like the blind leading the blind. They don't have the data. They'll say, oh, a glass of wine is fine. A beer is good. My doctor said. There are a lot of doctors out there who are the older generation who do not have all of this information. Fortunately, my daughter, who just finished medical school, said they had a full day in OB on the effects of alcohol on prenatal. So hopefully there will be a generational change too. But at this time, we are trying to spread the word that every single organization is saying no amount at any time. So briefly, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. It's a spectrum of disorders, and it is resulting from a brain injury. So this isn't something that's curable. Once they have the brain injury, it is not treatable. It affects emotional regulation, impulse control, memory, balance. It affects executive function, which is why we tend to start seeing it in 7 and 8-year-olds, because that's when in class you are expected to sit still, or you're told, stand up, put your books away, get your coat, and line up. Our kids can stand up and get their coat, and then they're done. So these kids start getting labeled as they're not listening, they're not paying attention. As they get older and they don't have the impulse control, when they're 7 and 8, we forgive them. When they're 12 and 13 and they start hitting others, we don't forgive them. And so that's why usually around 7 or 8 is when we start seeing a lot of the effects of these brain injuries. It is only caused by prenatal alcohol consumption. It is permanent disability with no cure, although you might be interested to know that the University of Minnesota is in the forefront of research on FASD in the US. So between having Proof Alliance in Minneapolis, in St. Paul, and the U of M, we really are kind of the national center for research and support. So as I said, it affects a whole variety of, a whole number of parts of the brain. These two, the caudate nucleus and the cerebellum, those deal with learning, executive function, like I said, impulse control, coordination, sequencing, all these things that when they're 2 and 3 and 4, we don't notice or we forgive, but when they start getting older, really impacts their ability to function in society. It also affects the corpus callosum, which is kind of the superhighway. It connects the 2 parts of the brain, as well as the hippocampus. And what happened is, for the longest time, these were speculative, and then we started getting MRIs, and wow, we were able to see. So here's the corpus callosum in an FASD child. Here it is in a control. Here's the cerebellum. Look at the shrunken cerebellum. Look at the number of folds, which is actually where a lot of those kind of the engine of the brain is. You have far fewer folds. So we started seeing the electrical stimulation. So it's absolutely uncontrovertible evidence right now that when we have the MRIs, that the kids who have been exposed to prenatal alcohol have significant brain injury. So just for reference, the prevalence of autism is 1 in 68. Prevalence of FASD is 1 in 20. So 1 in 20 first graders. And this first came from a large study that was done for 6 years by the CDC. They looked at over 6,500 first graders. They used a very conservative definition of drinking. And they were starting to identify, and what they found was that teachers in classrooms, when they got training on FASD, were able to say, oh, that explains it. I couldn't, this kid has really been troubling me because he's a good kid, but I can't understand why he was behaving this way. We often get educators who come to our conference and it's like the light bulb went off and they're like, oh, we thought he was ADHD, but he wasn't. We thought he was this. And I'm saying he, of course, it's she as well. What we also found is that during COVID, I don't have the most recent slides, but during COVID, drinking went through the roof. North Dakota and Minnesota have some really high drinking rates, but alcohol consumption in general during COVID. But since the 80s, women have been drinking a lot more than they used to. And drinking both in terms of quantity, like the sizes of our wine glasses got so much bigger than like what they were when my parents were drinking, to just the frequency. People didn't go out to eat as much, right? There weren't these kind of boozy happy hours or unlimited mimosas for brunches. Right now, there are so many of our events that are tied to alcohol. So what we're seeing, and what I expect the next wave of this study is going to show, is that they're probably higher than 1 in 20, which is staggering. I mean, that is staggering. 1 in 20 first graders. You probably won't be able to see this very well, but I think one of the issues we've been running into in diagnosing is that there are so many overlapping characteristics of a child with FASD with others, like ADD or autism, bipolar. Now, we've seen the rates of autism kind of be discussed and seen to be much higher. I'm thinking that some of those are probably kids who are FASD. And the reason I think we are more inclined to diagnose them with ADD or ADHD or autism is that there's absolutely no blame on the parent. And parents actually, understandably, really struggle with admitting, acknowledging, accepting that my child has a brain injury because of something I did. Autism doesn't have that kind of stigma. ADD doesn't have that kind of stigma. But unfortunately, what happens is that some of our kids end up with 4 diagnoses, incorrect diagnoses, before they finally get the correct diagnoses. And in those years, they start to identify themselves as a bad kid. They're told so often, you are a bad kid. Not you have a brain injury, you're a bad kid. And so other behaviors really start getting internalized, review of themselves, the mental health issues that we'll talk about in a minute that also start to come out. So, and you can, I don't know if you can see it all, but it's everything. Doesn't follow directions, easily distracted, interrupts, difficulty organizing tasks, difficulty with transitions. I think we could all say, if we've had kids, oh, our kids have several of those. Kids with an FASD will have many, many, many of those. Makes it very hard for them to function. The secondary conditions, I think, are frightening. 94% suffer from some kind of mental illness. And by that, we mean everything from depression, anxiety, understandable, right? They don't understand their environment. They don't understand how to respond to what's being asked of them. And again, keep reminding yourself, it's a brain injury. They can't do anything about it. This isn't a behavior that you can teach them out of or punish them out of. This is a brain injury. 60% are involved in the criminal justice system. Disruptive school experiences, they're always getting thrown out of schools and having to start over again. And you can imagine what that will do to a kid's psyche. A lot of inappropriate sexual boundaries. They don't read social cues very well. They want to please. They don't often understand what's happening. And so they are the kids who get caught with the gun. They're the kids who are delivering the drugs. They may not know what's in there, but they want to please so much. They want to have friends that they're really susceptible to getting involved in the criminal justice system. A lot of alcohol, drug problems, and a much, much shorter lifespan, age 36 for a lot of them. A lot of suicide. a lot of drug overdoses. It's a terrible, terrible diagnosis. So 12.8 is the age at which kids become involved with FASD, on average, become involved in the criminal justice system. And I see a lot of these kids because they may be on my caseload as kids in need of protection and services, but they are concurrently delinquents. And again, we just talked about why some of that happens, but it's everything from their inability to control their impulses. They don't understand cause and effect very well. And again, it's not something we can teach them. And I keep saying that over and over because it's different from other kids who just may have behavioral issues. These kids actually have a brain injury that's causing this lack of boundary. They have difficulty identifying dangerous people. They're very, very influenced. And they tend to come in contact again and again and again. Why? Because they don't understand consequences, right? So we don't have very good interventions. Now, I go till 1:10, right? Okay. We did a longitudinal study of 4 years in Hennepin County from 2016 to 2020, where I screened every kid who came in for an FASD, and we now passed legislation so that every child that comes into foster care in Minnesota will be screened for an FASD. And then we surrounded those kids with FASD informed adults. So we had a judge who understood FASD. We had social workers who understood FASD. We put them in foster homes that understood. And now foster parents are all trained on FASD in Minnesota. And what we saw was that when these people could acknowledge for this child, we know that you're not a bad kid. We know you have a brain injury. You need an external brain. Essentially, that's me, or whoever is their adult. They saw a reduction in disruption in placements, a reduction in disruption in schools, more consistency. So what we're trying to do is really create environments where a kid who comes in at 12.8, age 12.8, isn't going to be coming back at 14, 16, 18. One thing that's really nagging at me is that 33% of the kids in the foster care system have an FASD. 33% of our prison population has an FASD. In my mind, the connection is so clear, right? We have a group of people who are working their way through foster care and delinquency and finding their way into the prison system. In Canada, they've actually started an FASD court, kind of like we have a drug court here, where they're, again, trying to be an informed system where they're offering specific kinds of services to people with this brain injury. We have not guilty by reason of insanity. We have the incompetence defense, but right now we're not in any way recognizing that there's a third of our population, or 1 out of 20 of our kids, who are walking around with a brain injury that's really impacting their day-to-day life, and a huge cost to society as well. This is just a follow-up to show you that very few end up living on their own. Most are in institutions or dependent living, or still living with their parents as adults. And the main message for this piece in alcohol consumption is that been rising steadily, both among women. We think in part because they're going more, they're out more. Since COVID, it's continued to increase. 1 in 4 women admit to drinking at least twice during their pregnancies. It's not, FASD is not curable, it's 100% preventable. If you have daughters, if you have daughters-in-law, if you have teenagers in your home, if you have anybody that you can share this message with, if you need more information, Proof Alliance is an amazing resource. It's proofalliance.org. They have data sheets. They have this. In a seatbelt. Same with helmets, right? Skiing. We used to ski with no helmets. And now, if you're out on a ski slope, the majority of people have helmets. And it's the few that don't that you kind of shake your head and wonder and say, oh my gosh, what a fool, right? We need to get to that point with drinking. We need that kind of a paradigm shift. And that's, we're hoping this is a relatively recent diagnosis, really, in the whole grand scheme of things. And we're hoping that with this MRI information that we're getting, with the research that's being done, we're really going to be able to start moving toward that kind of a paradigm shift. So I'm going to now jump to the bottom of that list of drugs that I haven't talked about, fentanyl and analogs. This one I don't have as much data and research on because it really is just blindsiding us. It is, I've had 4 infant overdose deaths. I've had 2 toddler overdose deaths in the past 6 months. So I had been seeing many adults overdosing on my caseloads. I have never, ever seen this many kids. Some are near death. I have a lot of near-death overdoses, leaving us to kind of grapple with what is going on. So, 2016, June, Prince died of fentanyl overdose. And that was the first time really when I was like, fentanyl? Do we have fentanyl in the Twin Cities? I don't think I've had fentanyl in my cases. And sure enough, that is when a lot of news articles started popping up saying, how is fentanyl on the street? Fentanyl is a drug that is used during surgery to put people to deep, deep, deep sleep, right? And just so that you have some idea of the nature, it's an opioid. There are natural opioids that come from poppies, right? The poppy fields, morphine, codeine, amazingly good painkillers that are used for medical reasons. There are the semi-synthetic opioids, which is the hydrocodons, which is what we've kind of had that whole opioid crisis. Methadone is a very, very good synthetic opioid. It's a fabulous painkiller. It is also used to help weed heroin addicts off. So it's a synthetic that is given and then titered down to help heroin addicts kind of get lower their doses. And then there are these synthetic opioids like fentanyl that were previously used only in the medical field that started working their way onto the streets. And this is from 2016, so right around the same time that Prince died. And it said it's being distributed in the same manner as heroin, sold in powder and glassine bags. It's sold as heroin with many users not aware of the presence of fentanyl in their substances. So what we were finding and what they're thinking actually happened with Prince is he didn't know he was getting fentanyl. And because fentanyl, and as I'll show you in just a minute, is so potent, somebody taking what they thought was an opioid, a hydrocodone pill, or using a dose of heroin that they had used before, if it was laced with fentanyl, would lead to an immediate overdose death. So here's fentanyl masking as hydrocodone. What they're doing is they're pressing, this is one's fentanyl, one's hydrocodone. Can you tell which is which? So people who were buying hydrocodone pills on the streets were in fact getting fentanyl. Elephant tranquilizers. So all of a sudden we started seeing carfentanil. What the heck is carfentanil, right? And we were testing people and they would come in and say, I took a hydrocodone, but they didn't test for hydrocodone when we tested the tox screens, and they didn't test for fentanyl. And all of a sudden we started realizing that people are manufacturing this and are coming up with different analogs, slightly varying the composition to make it more and more and more potent. So according to the CDC, fentanyl was responsible for 64% of the overdose deaths from May 20 to April 21, 100,000 plus. So fentanyl just kind of hit the market in 2016, 2017, 2018, and then the analogs started evolving from that. We didn't have the tests for them. We didn't really know what their potency was. Big surge in the Midwest, 64.7%. And then really, really big increase in teens. And what we're finding is that right now, every single drug that is sold on the street, from pot to cocaine to meth, everything is laced with fentanyl. Every single drug. I was not a proponent of legalizing marijuana. I just thought we didn't know enough about the developing brain. I just thought we were letting out the genie out of the bottle and we'd never get it back in. Now that I see how much pot is being laced with fentanyl on the street, I'm like, you know what? If someone's going to use it, I'd much rather have them buy it and know that it's regulated and know that it's not laced with something. So if there's one message you walk out of here with, Siri's talking to me, is to let people know, if you have teenagers in your house, let them know what they think their friends are using, what they think is at a party, what they think is innocuous or mild, or it's just pot, is not anymore just pot if they're buying it on the street. Because one water bottle of liquid fentanyl is 250,000 doses. So they can transport it easily. They can sell a whole lot more and make a whole lot more money. And they can hook people on it because if they're not dying of an overdose, they are getting such a powerful high that they are instantly addicted. So don't know if you can see very well. I'm trying not to step off the microphone. The orange line is prescription opioids. And you can see those rising kind of from the time that we know they started hitting the market. You can see cocaine is kind of there along the bottom. And then that light blue line, starting in 2015, 2016, 2017, that's fentanyl and analogs. And that ends in 2020. I can tell you that from 2020 and 2023, it's probably off the charts. It is rampant. And the number of people dying is like nothing I've seen in my 30 years. So here's another example to show you. If you consider that middle circle potency to be morphine. So morphine is number one, right? So we're just going to say potency is 1. Heroin is double the potency of morphine. And a lethal dose is the size of a pea. Yes.
Can you try showing the screen again? That somehow got lost. Otherwise, keep going.
Yeah, no. I'll give it a go. It may take a second. That worked. Okay, so I'm not sure if I want to explain this because I think it's an interactive chart. I just couldn't get it to be interactive on my computer. So a lethal dose of morphine is size of a pea. Okay, and that's in the middle of our circle. Heroin, which is, you can't even see it here, twice the strength of morphine, and a sunflower seed size is a lethal dose. Fentanyl, which is the orange, the yellow in the middle, is 100 times more powerful than morphine, and a sesame seed size will kill you. And then some of these other analogs, sufentanil, carfentanil, which is the worst. Carfentanil is 10,000 times more potent than morphine, and you need a half of a grain of a grain of salt to kill you. Right. So what we're finding is, as we're trying to understand, how are these toddlers dying? How are these immobile babies dying? In one case, we figured that the parent had, and fentanyl and carfentanil and all of these analogs, they are crushed and snorted. They are injected. Sometimes they come in patches and people will chew the patches. So it's being smoked. It's any way that it can be ingested, it's getting ingested. What we figured is that the parent had it on their hands from crushing it, then used an iPad, and then the toddler used the iPad, and of course they put everything in their mouth. That's just that tiny, tiny little bit is all you need to have something that's 10,000 times more powerful than morphine. And in a little body, they don't stand a chance. Carfentanil is all over right now. That's what the drugs that are out there are being laced with. People don't know this. And recently, I have to say, since I've been on this rampage, my husband's been saying, hey, CNN just did a story on it. New York Times just did a big story on it. CBS News. I mean, I think we're trying to get the messaging out there to say, pay attention. If you're a drug user, you may think you're getting a hydrocodone pill, but if you're buying it on the street, you're likely getting carfentanil or fentanyl. If you're a pot smoker, if you're getting on the street, it will be laced with something. And the problem is that the dealers will lace it with fentanyl or spray it sometimes with fentanyl. But in the production, it may already have been cut with fentanyl earlier in the process. And so I work with the Native American community, so I have a lot of clients in the Little Earth area. And we know when there's a bad batch of Little Earth because on a weekend, we can have 6, 7 parents die. And when I was talking to the toxicologist at HCMC, I said, isn't there some way we could send out a warning? Like, can we say, hey, there's a bad batch? Like, because they tend to be the same dealers. And they said, well, we're really worried about doing that because that implies that there's a good batch. And right now, everything is laced. And so we're really worried about saying, and I don't know the right answer, but honestly, I mean, I don't know if you can hear it. My heart is racing. It is terrifying. It is terrifying. And like I said, we're just still trying to figure out how the immobile infants are getting it. We don't think it's going through the breast milk. We don't think if it's being smoked, there may be enough that they inhale to make them test positive for it, but not to overdose. So, part of what we want to do is better understand the transmission so we can educate the communities where there's a high drug use, because an addict is still wanting to protect their child. They love their kids. I mean, they're struggling with a chemical health addiction, but they don't want to hurt their children. And we're trying to figure out what do we tell them? How do we help them make sure that they can avoid this? So my message is every street drug is with fentanyl or an analog. And I'm using fentanyl as the shortened term for fentanyl and all of the analogs that were on that circle. And dealers, again, don't know the potency rate. And Narcan, which I'm sure you guys have all heard of, is very effective for heroin overdoses, is really, really effective for fentanyl and all of the analogs. And so they're putting them in schools now, which they should. And I know there was a big outcry, but I mean, this is our reality right now. And if we can save some kids from overdosing, especially if they don't know that they're ingesting something that is this potent, let's have them in the schools. Let's have them in the community centers. Let's have it. I mean, all the cops carry it in their cars. And yes, it costs a lot of money, but it's going to save lives.
It's the AED of choice. Huh?
Pardon?
It's the AED of choice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. So I'll open up to questions. I mean, I think I just wanted to, this is kind of, I don't know if this is what you were hoping for, Peggy. This is what we were talking about at the cocktail party, which is really not very good cocktail conversation, I'll just say.
I was wondering how they sell. What do they sell it at? I mean, like you said, I photo that, but you see these huge stacks of pills they're selling, right?
Right.
And the other question is, where does it come from? And if one sesame seed is deadly, you have to have an incredibly accurate chemist.
And you don't. That's the problem.
Well, but you have to. No, you have to, because 100,000 times there's got to be 1 million people that didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So the potency of the drug has to be on the scale of their aspect.
Yeah.
So who's doing that?
So they've been trying to track how it's coming into this. It sounds like the initial production is coming from China, and from China it's going to Mexico, and in Mexico is where they're doing the pressing. So it starts off looking like a white powder. It starts off looking like heroin. And I've been talking about all the people who inadvertently take it. There are who want to buy fentanyl, who are trying to get fentanyl and trying to use fentanyl because of the high. So there's definitely a population for whom that's a drug of choice. And so for those people, it is sold as a powder, and you can buy fentanyl. You can buy it online. I mean, there are a lot of dark web dealers. So it's coming from China, the initial ingredients. And the other thing that because they're synthetic, they don't need to grow poppies anymore, right? That was that was kind of slowing production before. Now, because they can get so easily, and because you can transport so many, I would say doses, hits, whatever, because they're so tiny, they can make a mint, and they are. But they are. I mean, there are very precise chemists that are pressing these. But
So what do they consider to be the size of people who take? If 100,000 people die, how many people take?
I don't know that number. I mean, but I inadvertently or intentionally, because I think inadvertently a lot of people are getting exposed to it. Yeah.
How do you ensure that the medications and prescriptions that are being doled out through the health system are safe when there's so much of this in the world? That how do you ensure that there's not cross-pollination?
That's a good question. I mean, I am assuming that the pharmaceutical companies that are producing this for medical consumption are regulated and very carefully monitored. And they're not doing the analogs. Like you're not going to find a hospital using carfentanil. I mean, they're using fentanyl, and fentanyl is potent enough for them. I mean, it's 100 times more potent than morphine, so that's all they need during surgeries. So they wouldn't be using any of the analogs. I'm assuming the pharmaceutical companies that they're working with are highly regulated. It's what's out on the street that isn't, and it's just crazy. Yeah.
Aside from us being here and listening to this and telling folks about it, what else can we do?
I think we're still, 2016 is when it started showing up. It's really only in the past year and a half that I have seen it just through the roof in our field. Practical. So I think in some ways we're still just trying to get our bearings. We have police officers who are afraid that there's transdermal absorption. And so they're really afraid to go into homes if they think that there's any kind of drug production, because they're afraid they're going to die on the spot. And there were a couple of stories like that in the paper in Ohio, and at least the doctors we talked to have said, no, you're not going to, it doesn't cross, it's not transdermally absorbed. So that's good. We said breast milk, I don't think it's going to go through breast milk. So can you inhale enough? We don't think so. We do think that it has to be, actually ingested somehow, but we're still trying to figure it out. I mean, and like I said, I'm not an MD, I'm not a toxicologist. I have some expert witnesses that I call all the time on my cases who are ER docs at HCMC who see the highest rates of them and the toxicologists there. And we just had them come and do a long 3-hour kind of chemistry analysis for us to teach us. But I think we're still trying to figure it out, honestly. I think you will see public service announcements. I think we're talking with Governor Walz, we're talking with, trying to say something, you got to message this out there somehow. People just don't understand.
How do you tell the difference in child with FASD and autism? Do you have to do
Oh. So interesting. Many of you may think of FASD as having certain facial features, right? So they have a very flat filbrum here, very kind of a flatter nose, but that's only 1 in 4. So that's just on the day or exposure during the time when the front of the face, because the embryo forms from back to front. Most of the other kids are beautiful, healthy, normal looking. So you really can't. We do have, if they do the neuropsych testing, which we do at Proof Alliance as well, and at the university, those are the 2 big centers in Minnesota, actually in the country, probably the 2 biggest. They do a whole battery of neuropsych tests, which can differentiate between autism and FASD. Obviously, if you have a parent who admits to ingesting alcohol during pregnancy, that helps. But often, even if a parent won't, the grandparent will, or the siblings, or they'll say, yes.
The in-laws.
So thank you very much.